again, I'm doing okay today. Show business, I was broke for years, you know. I never had any money. I couldn't buy nothing. I used to go to orgies to eat the grapes. Are you kidding? I had no money at all. My whole life, I never got a break with anything. You kidding? With me, nothing comes easy, nothing. Well, last week, my gay uncle died. Left me all his dresses. Don't get a break with nothing, Johnny.
Hasn't been a good year, has it?
I never had any luck with girls either. You kidding? Really? Never had any luck with it. By the time I was 16 years old, I had sex once and VD twice. Never had any. When I was a kid, I never got girls. Never.
Really?
My friends didn't know, though. I fooled them, you know. I used to go to drive-in movies alone and do push-ups in the back seat of my car. You know? I got a girl here and there, but nothing, you know.
Yeah.
Nothing. Well, one time I took out a real fat girl. Ooh, was she fat? Ooh, boy, girl, fat out there. Well, she was so fat, I mean, during sex, guys asked directions. You know what I mean?
Good morning. It's Saturday, Enemies of My Country Saturday, March the 23rd, and this is The True Conservative. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Serenity Prayer and the patriotic song of the day, we will have no free lunch, rules for radical conservatives, rules for retrogrades, rules for patriots, Bishop Barron, Ayn Rand, the 33 strategies of war, and the enemies of my country. All that and more when I get back. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I should not change, the courage to change the things I should, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen.
Come join hand in hand, brave Americans all, and rouse your bold hearts at their liberty's call. No tyrannous act shall suppress your just claim, or stain with dishonor America's name. In freedom we're born, and in freedom we'll live. Our purses are ready. Steady, friends, steady, not as slaves, but as free men our money will give. Our worthy forefathers, let's give them a cheer. To climates unknown did courageously steer. Through oceans to deserts for freedom they came, and dying bequeathed us their freedom and fame. In freedom we're born, and in freedom we'll live. Our purses are ready. Steady, friends, steady, not as slaves, but as free men our money will give. How sweet are the labors that free men endure, that they shall enjoy all the profits secure. No more such sweet labors Americans know, if Britons shall reap what Americans sow. In freedom we're born, and in freedom we'll live. Our purses are ready. Steady, friends, steady, not as slaves, but as free men our money will give. Then join hand in hand, brave Americans all. By uniting we stand, by dividing we fall. In so righteous a cause, let us hope to succeed. For heaven approves of each generous deed. In freedom we're born, and in freedom we'll live. Our purses are ready. Steady, friends, steady, not as slaves, but as free men our money will give. All ages shall speak with amaze and applause of the courage we'll show in support of our laws. To die we can bear, but to serve we disdain. For shame is to free men more dreadful than pain. In freedom we're born, and in freedom we'll live. that glory immortal may be. If she is but just and we are but free, in freedom we're born and in freedom we live. Our purses are ready, steady, friends, steady, not as slaves but as free men. Our money will give.
Thank you. And now there's no free lunch, 250 Economic Truths by David Bahnsen.
The free market is not a system. It is not a policy dictated by anyone in particular. It is not something that Washington implements. It does not exist in any legislation, law, bill, regulation, or book. It is what you get when people act on their own, entirely without central direction, and with their own property, and within human associations of their own creation and in their own interest. It is the beauty that emerges in absence of control. Jeffrey Tucker. Free enterprise, then, is the natural outflow of human action. Before there are interventions, regulations, stipulations, controls, or red tape, there are humans acting, associating, cooperating, building, and creating. The belief in man as a co-creator with God, the result of being made in his own image, drives me to believe that the human action a free enterprise system cultivates best honors his or her personhood and dignity. Out of the creative and free capacity of a humanity not living in servitude has mankind done her best work.
And that was There's No Free Lunch by David Bahnsen. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, rules for radical conservatives.
Here's what I'm talking about. Pretend to be like us, so do what we do. Lie. Adopt all of our manners and mores, right down to our mannerisms. Preface every statement with a handy, I read in the Times today that, or, as I was saying to Bill Moyers a few years ago out in Quogue, and watch heads swivel and eyes light up with a strange new respect. Before you know it, you'll have your own talk show on MSNBC. Or don't. Even rigid Stalinists like ourselves, every once in a while, have to fake diversity in something other than our Frankfurt-schooled race, gender, and class categorical imperatives. Which means that any given moment, there's room for up to 3 straight white practicing Christians at any given gathering. Except, of course, the editorial pages of the New York Times, which are strictly segregated. So why not be one of them? Think of the fun you can have as you're whisked around our cocktail parties like some exotic animal, and put on exhibition to show just how darn broad-minded we are, that we can tolerate someone like you in our presence. Why, the next thing you know, we'll actually start inviting black people over for social occasions instead of photo opportunities. In other words, develop your own network of spies, infiltrators, and fifth columnists. You've ceded vast swaths of the information infrastructure to us, which in one sense turned out not to be a bad thing for you, since it eventually gave you Fox News and us MSNBC. But let me tell you from personal experience, it really helps to have people on the inside, taking the pulse of the movement, probing its defenses, pushing the envelope about what you can or cannot say in polite company. Fox News has unleashed a vast army of babes, apparently all raised on the same hydroponics farm that produces les girls of the world-famous Crazy Horse nightclub in Paris, except smart enough to have earned law degrees. And we're putty in their hands. This is what keeps us up at night. In the good old days of the USSR, it was one of the dirtiest words in a good young pioneer's vocabulary. Revanchism, which means, more or less, revenge. Although we have done spectacularly well with the youth, young people are naturally on our side, because as the old saying goes, if you're not a liberal at 20, you have no heart, and if you're not a conservative at 40, you have no... Never mind. We can never really trust them. The job of young people is to revolt against their parents. And when the parents go from smiling patriarchal fascists like Robert Young in Father Knows Best and Fred McMurray in My Three Sons, to guys like my dad, the sainted Che Kahane, big hairy bears who didn't quite make it to Woodstock, but lied about being there just to get chicks, well, some young people are going to naturally start questioning authority. I mean, think about it for a moment. Put yourself in our Birkenstocks. We're the man now, fat, sassy, and socialist, which means we're also ripe for a takedown. This may, in fact, be one of the enemy's little jokes, to keep both of us locked in the Dar al-Harb until the final day of reckoning. But since we don't believe in any of that religious stuff, I choose to think that we can keep on co-opting the hearts and minds of young people ad infinitum, or until you finally wise up and show us otherwise. Bring in the kids. Your ideals and their idealism are made for each other. Many of them are already wising up to us. After all, they're the ones who are going to be left holding this big stinking bag of you-know-what we're leaving for them. Follow our game plan from the 1960s. Mock us at every turn, in every venue at your disposal, particularly those with youthful constituents. Refute the labels of prig and hypocrite we've pinned on you, and slap them on us. Then, offer the next generation a real alternative. Give them something to fight for. I have a horrible suspicion that you may be surprised again at how quickly the establishment turns when its children are set on bringing it down. Another of our favorite weapons is to break your system from within. The old Cloward Piven 1-2 punch. So why aren't you trying that on us? Instead of rolling over, apologizing, and retreating constantly, why aren't you merrily acceding to our every idiotic idea, thus hastening the day when our version of socialism in one country collapses just as it did in the Soviet Union? Admittedly, this is a riskier strategy. But think of the fun you could have by voting for every tax increase, expanding welfare, promising every American, including illegal Americans who haven't even stolen across the borders yet, a guaranteed annual wage, one that would allow them to live in affordable housing anywhere in the U.S. of A. at taxpayer expense.
And that was the next part of Chapter 20 from Rules for Radicals, or Radical Conservatives, by David Kahane. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Rules for Retrogrades, 40 Tactics to Defeat the Radical Left.
Rule 33. Stop heralding unwelcome news of progressive victories by wishfully proclaiming, channeling Japan's Admiral Yamamoto circa Pearl Harbor Day, that radicals have awakened a sleeping giant. The platitude is beyond being banal and naive. It's triumphalistic in the most tone-deaf way, and therefore it must be anathema to the retrograde if we are to see our worldview win the day. Yet, in the face of shameless leftist mischief, the reimagining of the American healthcare system through the Affordable Care Act, the attempted coup against Donald Trump by nefarious deep state actors, the attempt to usher in Catholic women priestesses in the Amazon Synod, etc., we have heard ad nauseum that certainly the latest bits of news from the front will finally push passive observers over the edge, awakening in them a fighting spirit sufficient to spur them to rise up en masse and finally vanquish our ideological foes, restoring common sense and decency to the public arena. Horse feathers. Countenance the fact that most men don't have fighting spirits, or at least have dulled them with lives of vice and indulgence, and of the few that do, most need their dormant fighting spirits to be invigorated by an even smaller strata of strong men with vision. It is an illusion of the most dangerous sort to believe that coming eye to eye with an injustice, men will naturally rise up and take the necessary actions to set the world aright again. The retrograde should constantly and soberly remind himself that the fallen human condition is such that feeble men, on the whole, will adapt to and even embrace even the most perverse and unpalatable regimes, so long as they have ample entertainment, cake, and carnal pleasures. billions of people have endured, many with smiles, severe repression at the hands of tyrannical states like Red China, North Korea, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, and Germany's Third Reich. These regimes have denied people fundamental freedoms such as familial integrity, freedom of speech, and freedom of religion, strictures far beyond those fathomable to the fatted Western mind. And yet, despite the Spartan conditions and dystopian laws of such states, political dissension was or is underwhelming, even moribund. Never underestimate man's ability to abide an evil to which he has become accustomed. The uninspired man eventually accepts his lot and resigns himself to suffering it rather than risking his few creature comforts and perhaps even his life and liberty in favor of justice, intangible as it is. Only the unworldly and noble man can risk tangibles for ideals. Like in the film High Noon, complacent men, who are sadly the vast majority of the race, will make every excuse to avoid the inconvenience and risk that accompanies the defiance that is part and parcel of being a retrograde. Thus, that sleeping giant so giddily touted by armchair activists is often no more than a paper tiger. Moreover, to many, the sleeping giant metaphor represents a groundless assurance that goodness will ultimately win the ongoing cultural and political wars, despite a seemingly endless succession of radical triumphs in battles which forebode just the opposite. Hence, the metaphor is false catharsis, a dishonest emotional pacifier for those who need to self-soothe in the wake of bad news. It is a failure to come to terms with objective reality. Such a failure to grasp the current state of the world is a roadblock for the retrograde agenda. In order to fight the wiles and schemes of radicals, we need people to get mad and to stay mad, mad enough that they're willing to spend their energy and treasure on the raging culture wars. When the cockeyed optimist assures his fellow men that all is well, that indeed a sleeping giant of dedicated retrogrades will invariably arise to win the culture wars, despite losing battles with alarming frequency, he squelches their righteous anger. After all, if all is well, then there is no need for mobilization going forward. Blind optimism disincentivizes necessary and fruitful engagement by retrogrades because it prematurely claims victory solely on the basis that people notice and object to the acts of radicals. Thus, the rank sentimentalist who suggests that goodness is somehow destined to prevail in the temporal struggle should be the object of the retrograde's scorn. Such a man has yet to wrap his mind around theodicy and the mystery of iniquity. The sleeping giant metaphor lulls would-be agitators into an undue passivity, since it wrongly assumes that wheels are in motion that will culminate in the undoing of radicals' misdeeds. It essentially conflates people's initial reflexive outrage over perceived injustices with organized and efficacious political engagement. It assumes that because people are angry, they will direct their anger into the proper channels by which change may be effected. This is akin to confusing potential energy with kinetic energy. The fact that a political or cultural injustice wrought by radicals irks the consciences of the masses is a mere starting point. It's an aggregation of potential energy. But in order to do any good, this potential energy needs to be actualized and released through political organization and transformed into political movement, whether in speech, demonstrations, volunteerism, or capital donation. If initial outrage is never actualized into political movement, then it evaporates with the oscillations of the human mind, or slowly dies out, like a fire having burnt through all its fuel. So, the rousing of people's passions in response to an injustice should not be received as a victory in and of itself. Rather, it should be viewed as a starting point by which, through methodically directed political engagement, true victory can one day be achieved. And since the sleeping giant metaphor undercuts efficacious political engagement, snuffing it out while it's still in inchoate form, the metaphor is to be removed from the retrogrades vocabulary.
And that was Rules for Retrogrades, rule number 33, from the book Rules for Retrogrades, 40 Tactics to Defeat the Radical Left by Timothy and David Gordon. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Rules for Patriots.
Not to mention the fact Scarborough has a daily show on national television. Do you ever recall him ranting about Obamacare, Fast and Furious, Eric Holder, or what Obama's policies have done to the economy with the same fervor he went after conservatives here? Come to think of it, how often did you hear Jeb Bush opposing the Obama regime? Former First Lady Barbara Bush was critical of the, quote, harsh tone of the 2012 GOP primary. See that as the vetting of Romney. But where was she while the American people were suffering under the harshness of the Obama regime's statist policies? I could probably write an entire book on how the Republican Party establishment goes after its own base more than it ever does Democrats. And maybe someday I will. But by now, you get the picture. Several times during the 2012 campaign, I had newspaper reporters from across the country contact me for my take on what Romney has to do to rally his base for the general election. I always told them they were asking the wrong question. The question isn't whether or not Romney would be able to successfully rally his base. The question is whether or not he actually wants to. His people demanded Republican National Committee members sign some ham-fisted loyalty pledge that smacks of a George Orwell plot device. His people tried to alter the party rules to stifle the increasing Tea Party/Liberty influence. If this was Romney wanting to woo us, he had a funny way of showing it. Ladies, imagine for a second the guy you're interested in rarely, if ever, calls, takes no initiative to show you he cares, but then turns around and demands you give him the attention he desires whenever the mood suits him. After a while, your girlfriends would urge you to salvage whatever shred of dignity you had left and admit that he's just not that into you. Let me share with you what I have learned fighting the Republican Party establishment through the past 2 presidential primary cycles and what I shared with these reporters. At best, the Republican Party establishment views its grassroots base as what kids today would refer to as a hookup or a booty call. At worst, they outright hate us, because we're the reason the GOP cronies don't get away with pillaging and plundering the public trough for their buddies with the same reckless abandon as the Democrats. From day one, the Romney campaign had 2 prime directives: marginalize the influence of conservatives, especially evangelicals, within the GOP, and then to defeat Obama. They wanted to prove so much they could win without us, so they had an excuse to banish us to the kids' table after they were done. That's why Romney never reached out to us, just as his predecessor McCain never did, until putting Palin on the ticket. And then after her stunning speech at the Republican National Convention, they never put her in a position to shine like that again. See, in the GOP establishment's world, Palin is the reason McCain lost, not the reason he actually didn't lose as bad as Walter Mondale or George McGovern did. Losing is in these folks' DNA. They claim to be incrementalists, but they're really just defeatists. These folks would rather lose to Democrats than lose control of the Republican Party to us. They just don't see it as losing, because losing to them isn't defined by not getting to govern. In fact, they would rather not have to govern so they can perpetually raise money off of the naive sheeple out there by proclaiming how bad the Democrats are all the time. Losing to them is defined as losing leverage, not elections. If they're not in charge, it's fine with them if the Democrats are. The golden rule to them is he who has the gold gets to make the rules. I'm not saying they don't care about the future of the country. It's just they define what's best for the future a lot differently than you or I do. They have more in common with Democrats than they do the Patriots in the grassroots. Mothers have been advising their daughters for eons now that he ain't going to buy the cow if you give him the milk for free. Conservatives have been freely giving their milk to the Republican Party establishment for 30 years. And what do we have to show for it? Is the government bigger or smaller? Are taxes and fees, a tax by another name, higher or lower? Is the country more or less secularized? Are government schools more or less likely to indoctrinate your kids with anti-American or anti-Christian propaganda? Our children, even our Christian children, born and bred in the church, are poised to undo all of this nation's moral foundations in the name of wrongly defined tolerance. We must come to grips with the fact the party of Reagan isn't the party of Reagan. Reagan was the Republican Party's aberration. From Ford to Reagan to both Bushes to Dole to McCain and to Romney. One of these things is not like the other, and it's Reagan. The Republican Party is the party of big government. It just believes that having the complete statist monstrosity the left wants is icky. It doesn't want to end child killing. It wants to regulate it. It doesn't want to oppose the homosexual agenda. It wants to moderate it. It doesn't want to return power back to the states and to the people. It wants to channel it toward its vested interests instead. All conservatives have been doing via the GOP for this past generation is slowing down into a steady jog, the breakneck slouch towards Gomorrah the left desires.
And that was another part of Chapter 9 from Rules for Patriots, How Conservatives Can Win Again by Steve Deese. And I wanted to say that the reason that you have people like Romney and Senator McCain is because, and the other squishy so-called moderates, is because we know we're right, but we keep losing. And after you lose, you go out, whether you go onto an interview on television or you get into a debate or whatever, and you lose and you're made to look bad, you begin to wonder after a while, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe my ideas are wrong. Maybe being anti-abortion is wrong. And really, it's not wrong. It's not that we're wrong. It is that we're being tricked. And once you understand that it's all a trick, that's why I play Rules for Radical Conservatives, because he explains in there a lot of the tricks the left uses. Does it in a rather entertaining way. But anyways, it's all a trick. And when you learn that it's a trick, you lose your fear. And then it's just a matter of learning what tricks that they are using and defeating them. And once you're able to do that, you can't lose. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Bishop Robert Barron.
The more you walk the path of Christ, the more you will be opposed. You know that, don't you? And people say, what do you mean I'm going to be opposed? Well, just wait. You'll find out. If you're consistently on the path of Christ, trust me, they will come out after you. You know that line from Churchill I've quoted many times? Never trust a man who has no enemies. That means he stands for nothing. Dead right, it seems to me. It's right in the political world that Churchill was in, but it's even more correct in the spiritual world. Never trust someone who is not being opposed. That means almost certainly he's not walking the path of the Lord.
And that was Bishop Robert Barron. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now the Ayn Rand thought of the day. Quote, today, the very motive that draws a man to art, the quest for enjoyment, makes him run from it for his life. He runs to the gray, sunless, meaningless drudgery of his daily routine with nothing to relieve it, nothing to expect or to enjoy. And he soon stops asking the tortured question, is there anything to see tonight? Is there anything to read? Along with art, he gives up his vision of values and forgets that he ever hoped to find or to achieve them. And that was the Ayn Rand thought of the day. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now the Daily Law for March the 23rd.
March 23rd. Listen to your frustration. The composer Richard Wagner had worked so hard on his opera Das Rheingold that he became completely blocked. Beyond frustration, he took a long walk in the woods, lay down, and fell asleep. In a sort of half-dream, he felt himself sinking in swiftly flowing water. The rushing sounds formed into musical chords. He awoke, terrified by a feeling of drowning. He hurried home and noted down the chords of his dream, which seemed to perfectly conjure up the sound of rushing water. These chords became the prelude of the opera, a leitmotif that runs throughout it, and one of the most astonishing pieces he had ever written. Similar stories are so common as to indicate something essential about the brain and how it reaches certain peaks of creativity. We can explain this pattern in the following way. If we remained as excited as we were in the beginning of our project, maintaining that intuitive feel that sparked it all, we would never be able to take the necessary distance to look at our work objectively and improve upon it. Losing that initial verve causes us to work and rework the idea. It forces us to not settle too early on an easy solution. The mounting frustration and tightness that comes from single-minded devotion to one problem or idea will naturally lead to a breaking point. We realize we are getting nowhere. Such moments are signals from the brain to let go, for however long a period necessary, and most creative people, consciously or unconsciously, accept this. Daily law. Walk away when you're blocked. Do something else. The brain will eventually lead you back. Mastery Chapter 5. Awaken the dimensional mind, the creative active.
And that was the Daily Law for March the 23rd from the Daily Laws by Robert Greene. Back in a minute. Thank you. If you're a Democrat, a right-thinking Democrat, you need to vote Republican and become a Republican. We are the true party of government. We are the ones that love government. The Democrat Party just loves power. Back in a minute. Thank you. In order to win, I must defeat the voters to defeat the office holders. Nancy Pelosi is only as strong as her support. I know that the vast majority of Nancy Pelosi's support is from the useful idiots. I know that the useful idiots are easy to defeat because they rely on talking points. I know that simply contradicting the talking points is enough to stop the useful idiots. I know that winning is about stopping the useful idiots, not necessarily converting them. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now a little bit again of Varney and Company, and they're playing a clip from Bill Maher.
Stop acting like life in America in 2024 is unbearable. Biden's ratings are in the toilet, not because he's doing such a bad job, but because a lot of Americans like to live with their head in the toilet.
So anyways, this is a ridiculous comment on at least two levels. First of all, it's goes contrary to my experience and the experience of tens of millions or hundreds of millions of Americans, and because it's gibberish. He's not doing good. His ratings are in the toilet because Americans' heads are in the toilet. That doesn't make a damn bit of sense. Bad English, he fails to communicate, so he gets an F right there. But why would he stand in support of the Biden administration, who is obvious to anybody who has senses, can see and hear and smell the fact that he's doing a crappy job? Why would he do it? Again, the Democrats are looking at the executive branch as participatory. They look at it as an administration, and that means that it's not contrary to the Constitution, where you have one person that's making the call and making the decisions on behalf of the executive branch. They look at it as a committee, executive branch by committee, and that the only role that Joe Biden is supposed to play is that of a figurehead. His job is just to go out and smile and tell funny stories, and other than that, he may or may not participate in actual decisions that are being made behind the scenes, if you will. It'll actually be probably his wife, his sister, his other advisors, plus cabinet members that all sit down and try to make the decisions as to what it is that has to be done. Then all they need him for is his signature, right? It was like the first day in office when he had a stack of executive orders. And he said, I don't even know what I'm signing. And they basically said, just shut up and sign it. That's all they need him for. They don't care about his cognitive abilities or disabilities or anything else. He's just there to literally rubber stamp their decisions. But again, so they're looking at it as a participatory democracy, and as opposed to Donald Trump, who does things constitutionally. He says if he's going to be president, he's going to make the call. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now we pick up where we left off with the 33 strategies of war.
Interpretation. Leo McCarey, one of the great directors of Hollywood's golden era, was essentially a frustrated composer and songwriter. He had gone to work directing slapstick comedies. McCarey was the man who paired Laurel with Hardy, only because he was unable to make a living in music. The Awful Truth is considered one of the greatest screwball comedies ever made, and both its style and the way McCarey worked on it stemmed from his musical instincts. He composed the film in his head in just the same loose yet logical way that he would tinker with a tune on the piano. To create a film this way required two things: room to maneuver and the ability to channel chaos and confusion into the creative process. McCarey kept his distance from Cohn, the actors, the screenwriters, in fact, everyone, as best he could. He would not let himself be boxed in by anyone's idea of how to shoot a film. Given room to maneuver, he could improvise, experiment, move fluidly in different directions in any scene, yet keep everything perfectly controlled. He always seemed to know what he wanted and what worked. And because filmmaking this way made every day a fresh challenge, the actors had to respond with their own energy, rather than simply regurgitating words from a script. McCarey allowed room for chance and the random events of life to enter his creative scheme without being overwhelmed by chaos. The scene he was inspired to create when he learned of Dunn's and Bellamy's lack of musical skill, for example, seems unrehearsed and lifelike because it really was. Had it been scripted, it would have been far less funny. Directing a film, or any project, artistic or professional or scientific, is like fighting a war. There's a certain strategic logic to the way you attack a problem, shape your work, deal with friction, and the discrepancy between what you want and what you get. Directors or artists often start out with great ideas, but in the planning create such a straitjacket for themselves, such a rigid script to follow and form to fit in, that the process loses all joy. There's nothing left to explore in the creation itself, and the end result seems lifeless and disappointing. On the other side, artists may start with a loose idea that seems promising, but they are too lazy or undisciplined to give it shape and form. They create so much space and confusion that in the end, nothing coheres. The solution is to plan, to have a clear idea what you want, then put yourself in open space and give yourself options to work with. You direct the situation, but leave room for unexpected opportunities and random events. Both generals and artists can be judged by the way they handle chaos and confusion, embracing it, yet guiding it for their own purposes.
And that was the next part of Chapter 20, Maneuver Them into Weakness, from the 33 Strategies of War by Robert Greene. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Chapter 45, from the Enemies of My Country.
45. Joanne sat beside Duchess in the Opsin, watching the president's address at Monticello as it unfolded live on CNN. The Opsin was down to a skeleton crew. With no mission in progress, their role was to monitor the situation in Charlottesville and serve as an additional conduit to the Intelligence Division vehicle in the presidential motorcade, supplying any real-time data regarding Barry Khan's plans as that information became available through a network of overseas sources. Which, of course, hadn't occurred. There had been no further intelligence on the location of the rockets or Barry Khan's whereabouts. Duchess had expended virtually all her remaining credibility on raiding a Chinese billionaire's yacht, which at the time represented the highest possibility of affiliation with the Uyghur separatist who'd taken control of the rockets in Syria. And this lack of progress seemed to be reflected in Duchess's posture. She was currently seated beside Joanne with arms folded, watching the screen as if it were a funeral procession. What she had to sulk about, Joanne wasn't sure. Duchess had somehow pulled her career out of the ashes, having been granted an extension from Gosweiler under the condition that she find the rockets at all costs. And rather than relish that fact, Duchess appeared upset that the Charlottesville visit had proceeded against her best advice. Joanne asked, "Are you pissed because the president didn't cancel this visit?" 100%. You? Not really, Joanne admitted. She knew this wasn't what Duchess wanted to hear, but it was the truth. There's no indication that the rockets have made it stateside. For all we know, Barry Khan could be hunkered in a safe house, waiting for the arrival of his cargo. Duchess countered, but those rockets are a lethal threat, one that exceeds even the Secret Service's capabilities to stop them. There's not an air defense network in America outside of D.C. that could shoot them all out of the sky at once. And just one of those rockets could take out a tank. That's what they were designed to do, and that's why we supplied them to the Syrian resistance fighters. Can you imagine the effects of hundreds of them impacting within our shores? But it's still a hypothetical. If we had some concrete intelligence that the attack was proceeding on time after everything that happened in Syria, I could see altering the presidential schedule. As if in vindication of her statement, the president concluded his address, pausing beside the Indian president for a final photo op before both men stepped out of the room in Monticello to the flickering lights of journalist cameras. He was now leaving without the slightest whiff of a terrorist attack against him. For a moment, Joanne felt proud of herself. No matter the dark realities of her job, she refused to lapse into the void of cynicism and despair that seemed to overcome Duchess and, to an extent, many of the old hands on the agency team. Some of them showed up to work with the grim determination of factory workers, seeming not to relish their job but resent it. Duchess said, "Looks like you were right anyway. No terrorist attack, not even an attempt. Congratulations, Joanne. Who knows, maybe we're one step away from being shut down no matter what happens." Would that be so bad? Her counterpart seemed thrown off guard by that comment. "You sound like you're questioning the efficacy of this program," she replied incredulously. "By this point in time, aren't you?" "It doesn't matter what I think," Duchess replied. "You'll probably be around long after Gosweiler throws me to the wolves. What are your thoughts?" Joanne swallowed, considering her words. "I think this program is indicative of the fundamental miscalculation in how we as a nation use our military. We don't send enough troops when they're needed, and then we send too many once the situation has already spiraled out of control. Case in point." Joanne looked like she'd been slapped. "How about bin Laden?" she replied. "We had so many chances to put a bullet in his head immediately after 9/11. He spent a month in a Kandahar safe house, then another month in Kabul before making any attempt to flee the country. Another 2 months near the border being hunted by a literal handful of Delta operators and CIA officers, the leader of which requested a few hundred Rangers, who were located a few hours away in Bagram, mind you, to block off the mountain passes in Tora Bora." Duchess smiled. "Gary, hell of a good officer. And he was refused because the Bush administration believed that the Pakistanis would turn over bin Laden if he made it across the border. So bin Laden walks into Pakistan uncontested, where he had safe haven for the next decade, while we deployed close to 1 million troops to the desert for an endless counterinsurgency. And you're concerned that we're seeing the new Tora Bora?"
I'm concerned that Long Wing is an extension of the mentality that fetishizes the surgical application of force when more assets would accomplish twice as much in half the time. Look at what happened with Bari Khan. He escaped because we're using a 5-man team with minimal local assistance. It's not enough. Joanne, I have to say I disagree with you completely. Not for the first time, she replied, throwing her hands up, but I haven't stated anything that isn't a known fact. I'm not questioning your facts. I'm questioning your logic. The time to put a bullet in his head, as you so eloquently put it, wasn't after 9/11. It came and went long before then. If we're speaking with the benefit of hindsight, sure. How much hindsight do you need? We could have snatched him in the 98 Tarnack Farms raid, which we rehearsed for months before the agency leadership lost their nerve to seek presidential approval. 3 months later, bin Laden bombed our embassies in Kenya and Tanzania and killed a couple hundred people. There was a cruise missile strike after that, Joanne pointed out. Duchess nodded. A strike that missed him by a few hours, which brings us to the spring of 99, when bin Laden was at Sheikh Ali hunting camp in Afghanistan. That strike was scrapped due to diplomatic considerations about the presence of Emirati nationals, who, mind you, were his personal friends, if not financiers. 3 months later, he was stationary in Kandahar for 5 days, and no one was willing to launch cruise missiles despite arguably the best intelligence to date. So he bombs the USS Cole in 2000 and kills another couple hundred people. CENTCOM then presented 13 options for phased bombing campaigns against bin Laden and his organization, all of which went unused. All the while, the administration waffled back and forth over whether it was permissible to kill him if a capture wasn't possible. There were miscommunications between the administration and the agency, later redactions of clear kill authority in the memorandum wording, and opportunities slipping through our nation's fingers like so many grains of sand. Joanne replied, "You seem to be advocating a blanket approval policy regardless of the fidelity and intelligence. I can list a few regimes that have done the same, and none of them represent what I think America should become. You're missing my point, and I'm not finished." Joanne fought the impulse to roll her eyes. "I thought you were about to run out of breath. There's more." "There is. I haven't mentioned the December 98 rocket strike, refused by Clinton on the grounds of a prospective 300 civilian casualties. A decision he later praised himself for in a speech less than 24 hours before the 9/11 attacks commenced and killed nearly 3,000 Americans. And let's not forget the CIA officers operating in Sudan in 92, who watched bin Laden every day and had a plan to assassinate him that made it all the way to the director before being shut down." Spinning her chair to face Joanne, Duchess continued, "It doesn't matter who pulls the trigger so long as it gets pulled. There's no shortage of people willing to go into harm's way, regardless of what uniform they wear, or don't wear, as the case may be. The real linchpin is political approval. We've got that for the time being, and for once it's in alignment with our nation's capabilities. But this represents a precious and fleeting opportunity. Longwing is still a burning coal, far from the fire it needs to be. Those 5 men you consider insignificant represent the future of stopping not catastrophic attacks, but the junior terrorists before they become masterminds capable of planning them. And it's up to us to prove the efficacy of this concept by writing a playbook that works. You thought that I only cared about my career when I authorized the final raid in Syria. But this program is my real concern, regardless of whether it's me running it or not." Joanne replied in a challenging tone, "How noble of you. It doesn't matter if it's noble, only if it's necessary. In a way, it's not even about the attacks we can prevent. Those are just the beginning." "The beginning of what?" Duchess closed her eyes and drew a breath. 3,000 died on 9/11. But since then, there have been over 7,000 U.S. military deaths in Afghanistan and Iraq alone. Civilian casualties abroad are in the 6-figure range by the most optimistic estimates. Some say that number is 1 million or more. I'm aware of the statistics. Then be aware that what this program is designed to stop isn't just terrorists. It's the war, or wars, that would very likely follow an attack of that magnitude. She leaned back in her seat. "And don't ever underestimate our enemies. There is no limit to what a smart, determined terrorist can accomplish. Make no mistake, Joanne, until those rockets and Bari Khan himself are found, we are living each moment on the razor's edge. 46. Cancer threaded his way through the crowd at the airport, having followed the convoy back to its point of origin. And he was severely pissed. There was some silver lining to the situation. The leader of the free world had survived what the team had suspected was an imminent rocket attack, after all, but that was about the only happy consequence at present. Sure, he supposed there was technically a chance that BK would hit the president now that he'd returned to the airport, but Cancer knew in his gut that wouldn't be the case. If Bari Khan had the ability to point 633 rockets at the tarmac, he damn sure wasn't going to give the Secret Service an extra few hours to locate them by waiting until his target was on his way back out of the state. He would have let the president land, stroll from the helicopter toward his armored limo, and let him rip. And beyond that, there was nothing for Cancer to react to. Shoot. Be of good use in furthering as he slipped back into the banal Western existence that was completely devoid of adrenaline or conflict of any kind. Even that existence, he thought, was soon going to be reduced to the confines of a prison cell after Duchess realized what they'd done. After all the preparations, the speculation as to what Bari Khan would do or how, the team was back to square one, fully aware that their terrorist was in the wind along with the rockets, and nothing to do about it. Finding a vantage point overlooking the tarmac, he plucked his trusty pack of Marlboros from his pocket with a mournful shake of his head, withdrawing a fresh Cancer stick and expertly lighting it with the first spark of his lighter. Then he watched the president depart his limo and stride across the tarmac with a Secret Service agent moving one pace to his front right. They approached Marine One's waiting stairs, the helicopter's twin engines spooled up for the flight ahead. The president crossed in front of a Secret Service agent, standing with his hands folded, facing the motorcade. Then his escorting agent peeled off, and the president approached the helicopter alone, the lowered front stairs flanked by a pair of saluting Marines in full-dress uniform. Returning the salute without breaking stride, the president mounted the stairs and disappeared inside the helicopter. A somber procession of 7 men trailed him, 4 carrying large briefcases as they moved up the aircraft's rear set of stairs. Only then did the president's original escorting agent trot up the front steps, followed by one of the Marines who pulled up the steps behind him as the other fired off a crisp salute to the aircraft, turned an about face, and marched away. Cancer knew what was occurring outside of the camera's purview. The remainder of the president's top staff, along with a considerable Secret Service escort, had already boarded the trailing helicopter and trio of Osprey aircraft, unaccompanied by the ceremonial Marines who greeted the president upon his arrival. By then, Marine One was already taxiing down the tarmac, trailed by the 4 aircraft. Cancer took another drag of his cigarette and muttered to himself, "Well, shit." 47. I stepped through my front door, slamming it shut and locking it behind me. Entering a code onto the keypad, I silenced the repetitive beeping of my security system and whirled toward the stairs. Ascending them 2 at a time, I felt the anger surging inside me, a white-hot coal of rage. I'd given every possible warning about the attack to Duchess and waited for Bari Khan to make his next move, only for nothing to happen at all. I'd assembled my team in Charlottesville with their agency equipment, and in doing so inadvertently committed them to life in prison. And in the process of burning my team to the ground, I had absolutely nothing to show for it. It would be one thing if thousands of civilians were saved in the process. To be incarcerated until the end of time over a series of miscalculations seemed a far crueler fate. At the same time, I couldn't reconcile the bare facts with my present reality. Any individual data point was bizarre unto itself. The combination of them was so fucking weird that there had to be something I wasn't considering. There simply had to be. Reaching the 2nd floor of my home, I strode down the hall and stopped at a door. After resting my palm on the handle for a second of hesitation, I threw it open. It was Layla's home office. I surveyed the interior for a moment, her desk and houseplants in the same tidy configuration they always were. Circling the room, I used my phone to photograph it from all angles, then opened the desk drawers in sequence and took pictures of the contents. Before she returned from Alexandria, I'd have to restore everything to its original position. Because right now, I was about to tear this fucking room apart. It was possible, of course, that the rockets were still in Syria or otherwise tied up in whatever logistical means Bari Khan had set in place. But that explanation didn't sit well with me. It was too convenient, too hopeful, and in my experience with criminal and terrorist organizations over the years, the real answers were anything but. I had to look at this from a new angle, one that would have previously seemed inconceivable. Central to that were two questions I hadn't previously asked myself. What if the intel we'd uncovered in Syria had nothing to do with my team's past in the mercenary realm? Shortly behind that, but equally valid, was the second hypothetical. What if our intel on the attack had nothing to do with the president's visit to Charlottesville? Both lines of inquiry were ludicrous, but since the president had come and gone without the slightest blip, I had little choice. And when I pursued that line of inquiry deeper, the plain fact was that the scrap of paper had mentioned Layla and Langley, not myself. Since my daughter was unlikely to have many enemies of substance at her age, this led me to consider what I knew, or thought I knew, about my wife. Her brother, Steve, was my roommate at West Point. I met her on a weekend trip to his mom's home in a Philadelphia suburb when she was visiting from Ohio State. We'd been college sweethearts until she broke up with me prior to my graduation and medical discharge from the military. I knew that her biological father had committed suicide, and her mother later remarried and moved to Charlottesville to take up residence with her new husband. There was nothing suspicious about any of that, nor of her stepfather, who had until very recently run a very successful local metalworking business before selling it and retiring to Alexandria. Layla's mother was a nice woman, if slightly judgmental of me. In that, she was fully justified, though neither she nor my wife knew the full extent of why. And her stepdad and I got along as well as could be expected. I couldn't envision any scenario in which either had some ties to organized terror or even international finance that held some nefarious link they were unaware of. As for Layla, what was there to be suspicious of? She was a loving and kind-hearted person, passionate about her budding career as a pediatric doctor, though frazzled as of late from her residency. And if I was being honest with myself, from the lack of parental support from my end. If she'd married a 9-to-5 banker or one of her fellow doctors, I suspected she'd have no problems at all. And maybe that was the key, I thought. I'd never suspected her of infidelity, though if she was having an affair with someone, there was little chance I'd be aware of it. Layla's residency involved long hours in close proximity with her fellow doctors, and while I'd met some of them at dinner events and cocktail parties, none had raised my hackles of suspicion in the slightest. For all my shortcomings as a husband and father, I trusted that I'd detect a fellow participant in the covert world of espionage or military action, justified or otherwise. Unless, of course, I'd never met him in the first place. Once my phone held the reference photos for Layla's arrangement of her personal and professional items, I began my search. Much of it could be dismissed at a glance. Medical journals and reference works, piles of med school textbooks, and academic case files with the patient names redacted. It was possible she'd hidden something within those pages, and I'd flip through them one by one if I couldn't find answers elsewhere. My thoughts were jarred by the sight of a leather-bound notebook in the top sliding drawer, an object familiar to me, though I'd never once touched it. This was her journal, and there were dozens like it stashed away upon completion. Considering the implications of what I was about to do, I lifted it and flipped open to the last written page. My eyes settled on a handwritten line selected at random. Is it another woman? After a year of marriage, I already feel like we're growing apart. I slammed the journal shut, setting it down as hot tears hit my eyes. She deserved her privacy more than I deserved mine, and at the moment, I couldn't bear the thought of seeing my domestic inadequacies through her eyes. If I couldn't find anything else, I'd go through that journal line by line in search of a clue, maybe something that Layla herself didn't recognize. I'd read it alongside Ian if I had to. A terrorist attack was in the works, whether I liked it or not, and if it took getting my feelings hurt to stop it, or breaking my heart, as the case may be, then that's exactly what I was going to do. But for now, there were other places to search, and I began poring through her remaining desk drawers. Then I found another mess of paperwork, neatly filed in large manila envelopes and labeled by date. Most of the stacks of paper within seemed to be too pristine for her to have handled much, photocopied packets of some kind. I was quickly able to discern why. These were the documents of her parents' sale of their metalworking business, a process that Layla had been peripherally involved in by way of helping them make the transition to Alexandria. This should have been a dead end, but something caused the hair on my forearms to rise before I realized what it was. Something both strange and familiar at the same time, though I spent no small amount of time flipping through the packets to figure it out. Eventually, I realized it was the typeface itself. And reaching the page that changed everything I thought I knew, my eyes settled on a line that made my breath hitch. Beneath the legal documentation of her parents' new residence in Alexandria was a second line. It read, "Next of kin, David, Layla, and Langley Rivers, 427 Spring River Drive, Charlottesville, Virginia, 22901. At that moment, I didn't need to consult the photograph I had of that scrap of paper I'd found in Syria. That image was emblazoned in my memory, as startling and vivid as if I were looking at it that second, and I knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that this particular sheet of the public domain was the same piece of paper. And that's when I realized the truth, however improbable. The Syrian connection with my family had nothing to do with me. Instead, it had to do with Layla's parents and their sale of the metalworking business in Charlottesville. Finding the phone in my pocket, I dialed Ian and breathed quickly, my heartbeat racing as I waited for the goddamned call to connect.
And that was The Enemies of My Country by Jason Casper, and it was chapters 45, 46, and 47. Back in a minute. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States today, bidding adios to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there, and reminding you that you are not neutral and that the government has no rights.